A hero destroyed an entire order of peacekeepers in a single afternoon. He killed children that day. He didn't hesitate. Just hours earlier, he had been one of the most beloved heroes the galaxy had ever known. What happened in between is the most tragic fall in Star Wars history. Not the most evil, not the most shocking, though it is shocking, the most tragic, because everything that led to it started with love. He loved his mother and watched her die anyway. He loved his wife and lost her because of the very choice he made to save her. He loved his teacher, his friends, his own sense of who he was, and he burned every one of those bonds to the ground, chasing a promise that was never real. Here is the question that should keep you awake for exactly as long as it takes you to fall asleep tonight. What if the thing that destroys you isn't hatred at all? What if it's love, twisted just slightly out of shape by fear, grief, and one man patient enough to wait years for the perfect moment to strike? That man was already watching him before he ever set foot in a Jedi temple. He was watching a small boy on a desert world, and he was already, quietly, planning. To understand how a boy who dreamed only of freedom became the most feared enforcer the galaxy has ever known, we have to go back to the very beginning. Back before the armor. Back before the mask. Back before the name that would one day make an entire galaxy fall silent. He was born on a world that seemed designed by the universe to produce nothing but hardship. A dry, sun-blasted place at the edge of civilized space, where moisture was currency and hope was a luxury few could afford. His mother was a slave, a gentle and quietly strong woman who spoke often of kindness, even in a place that offered her so little of it. There was no father. Some believe the Force itself willed him into being, that the same mysterious energy binding the galaxy together decided, for reasons no one has ever fully understood, to plant a seed of impossible potential into the womb of an enslaved woman on a forgotten desert world. Whether myth or truth, the boy who resulted from that impossible conception carried something no one around him could quite explain. Even as a small child, he could sense things before they happened. He could fix broken machines with an intuition that bordered on unnatural. He built things beyond his years, tinkered with technology most adults could not comprehend, and carried himself with a quiet, luminous curiosity that made those who met him pause and wonder what exactly they were looking at. His mother did what she could to shield him from the crueler realities of their existence. But slavery leaves marks that kindness alone cannot erase. He watched adults around him live and die as property. He learned early that freedom was not guaranteed to anyone, that suffering could arrive without warning or reason, and that the only real security in life came from within, from skill, from will, from the refusal to be crushed. These lessons, absorbed in the marrow of a child too young to fully process them, would echo through every choice of the rest of his life. He raced small pod vehicles for entertainment and occasionally for his owner's profit, hurtling through canyons at speeds that should have been impossible for a child his size and age to survive, let alone control. He survived not through recklessness, but through an almost supernatural awareness of danger, a heightened sense that let him thread through chaos other pilots could not even perceive clearly. The races themselves were spectacles of violence, disguised as sport, brutal contests where competitors sabotaged one another's vehicles mid-flight, where fatalities were common enough to be treated as background noise rather than tragedy, where crowds gathered specifically hoping to witness catastrophe alongside triumph. That a small child piloted these machines at all speaks to how little his safety mattered to those who profited from his skill. That he not only survived but thrived again and again, race after race, speaks to something else entirely. Something that transcended skill or luck and pointed instead toward a connection with the unseen currents of the universe that few beings across the entire galaxy's history had ever possessed in such raw, unfiltered abundance. It was, in hindsight, an early and unmistakable signature of the very power that would later be recognized as unprecedented among Force users. Something ancient and enormous was awakening inside a small boy who spent his days repairing droids and his nights dreaming, quietly, of freedom for himself and for his mother. The household he grew up in, if it could be called a household at all, belonged to a junk dealer of a species known throughout the outer territories for ruthless business practices and an almost total disregard for the well-being of those they owned. The boy and his mother were, in the eyes of galactic law, in that lawless corner of space, property rather than people, bought and sold, and traded, according to the whims of their owner, with no more consideration than one might give a piece of machinery. And yet within the walls of the small, sand-worn dwelling they shared, something resembling warmth persisted anyway, because his mother refused to let the circumstances of their bondage define the content of their bond. She told him stories at night, softened the edges of a harsh existence with whatever tenderness she could scrape together after long days of labor, and instilled in him, whether she fully realized it or not, an unshakable core of decency that would remain buried somewhere inside him, even in his darkest hours, many years later. He absorbed her compassion the way he absorbed everything else, completely and without reservation. And it became, alongside the trauma of slavery itself, one of the two competing inheritances he would carry for the rest of his life. A genuine, deep-rooted goodness sitting uneasily beside a growing, simmering rage at the unfairness of a universe that could allow someone as good as his mother to suffer as she did. He noticed, even as a very young child, the way certain adults around him seemed to move through danger with an ease that others lacked, an intuitive grace that let them avoid disaster before disaster fully announced itself. He did not yet have language for what this meant. He only knew that he could sometimes feel things before they happened, a flicker of awareness that arrived a half-second ahead of events themselves, warning him which wire not to touch, which shortcut through the settlement to avoid, which stranger to keep his distance from. It made him seem, to those who did not know him well, unnervingly perceptive for a child his age, and it made him seem, to the handful of people who loved him, almost otherworldly, touched by something none of them could quite name. That freedom arrived. When it finally did, wrapped in circumstances so strange that they felt almost engineered by fate. A ship carrying travelers from a much larger, much more complicated conflict happening far from that desert world found itself stranded there, and its passengers, desperate and resourceful, crossed paths with the boy and his mother. Among them was a Jedi, a guardian of peace and justice, from an order the boy had only ever heard of in second-hand stories. The kind of tales slaves told each other in hushed voices, half hope and half fantasy. This Jedi watched the boy interact with the world and felt something he could not ignore, a presence in the Force so overwhelming it defied easy explanation. Some Jedi measure potential in careful, cautious terms. This one felt something closer to destiny. He began to believe, quietly, and then with growing conviction, that he had stumbled upon the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of a being who would restore balance to the Force itself. It was an enormous weight to place on the shoulders of a child who did not yet know what the Force even was, let alone that he might be responsible for rebalancing its entire nature. A wager was arranged, one final race through the treacherous canyons, the boy's freedom staked against the outcome. He won, of course. Somewhere between talent and destiny, the outcome barely felt like chance at all. But there is a cruelty buried inside even his most triumphant childhood moment, because it purchased only his own freedom. The transaction covered a boy, not his mother. When the ship carrying him away from that world lifted into the twin-sunned sky, his mother remained behind in bondage, and the boy left with the Jedi carried with him a wound that would never fully heal. The knowledge that he had been freed while the person he loved most in the galaxy had not. He wept as the world shrank behind him. He was too young to understand the political and philosophical reasons the Jedi gave for why she could not immediately be freed as well. Too young to accept that duty sometimes demands leaving behind the people we love most, and old enough only to feel the specific, searing grief of abandonment disguised as necessity. It was the first great wound. It would not be the last, but it planted something dangerous and quiet in him. The belief that attachment always ends in loss, and that loss, if left unaddressed, festers into something far more corrosive. When he arrived among the Jedi, he was already older than most children accepted into their order. And this mattered more than anyone wanted to admit at the time. The philosophy of these ancient guardians held that attachments, fears, and strong emotions were dangerous pathways toward darkness, and that children raised from infancy within their walls could be taught, gradually and gently, to release such attachments before they ever truly took root. A boy who had already lived years in slavery, who had already loved and lost, who had already tasted grief and injustice and helplessness in ways most Jedi younglings never would, was an entirely different proposition. The council convened to debate whether he should be trained at all. Their eldest and wisest member, small in stature but immense in wisdom, looked into the boy and saw not just extraordinary potential, but extraordinary danger. He warned that fear was the seed of suffering, that attachment could curdle into possessiveness, that a being trained too late, carrying grief already lodged deep inside him, might never fully release the darker instincts already stirring in his heart. It was not cruelty that drove this hesitation. It was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had watched fear, anger, and loss transform gifted individuals into catastrophes. But wisdom, however hard-earned, does not always translate cleanly into compassion. And the boy who stood before the council that day heard, more than anything else, a group of powerful adults debating whether he deserved a chance at the life he had just sacrificed everything to reach. Standing in the center of that circular chamber, surrounded by the assembled masters of an order he barely understood, the boy felt something shift inside him that he would carry quietly for the rest of his days. A suspicion, never quite extinguished, no matter how many years passed or how many honors he later earned, that he would always be viewed first and evaluated second, that his power would always precede his personhood in the eyes of the very people meant to guide him. It was not an unfair reading of the room. Exactly. The masters gathered that day were not cruel, and their hesitation stemmed from genuine wisdom rather than malice. But wisdom delivered without warmth can wound just as deeply as malice. And a frightened, grieving child, standing alone in a room full of robed strangers, debating his fitness for love and belonging, absorbed every syllable of doubt far more thoroughly than he absorbed any of the reassurances that came afterward. He was accepted in the end, largely because the Jedi who found him refused to leave him behind, staking his own reputation and eventually his own life on the belief that this child represented something the galaxy desperately needed. That Jedi would not live to guide him for long. In the very battle that secured the boy's introduction to this new world, his mentor fell, cut down in a duel against a warrior trained in an ancient and supposedly extinct tradition of darkness, a tradition the wider galaxy had convinced itself no longer existed. With his dying breath, the fallen Jedi asked his own former student, a younger and less experienced knight, to take responsibility for the boy's training. It was an impossible request delivered in an impossible moment, and the request was honored more out of love and grief than confidence. And so began one of the most consequential relationships in the galaxy's history. An inexperienced young knight, still mourning his own teacher, suddenly responsible for shaping the mind and heart of a child, the wisest being in the Order had already flagged as dangerously unpredictable. The years that followed were, by most external measures, a triumph. The boy grew quickly into one of the most gifted students the Order had seen in generations, if not ever. His command of the Force outpaced his peers so dramatically that comparisons became almost meaningless. He absorbed lightsaber combat with an intuitive brilliance that left instructors astonished. He displayed an aptitude for machinery and technology that rivaled any engineer in the galaxy, tinkering and inventing in his spare hours the way other children might have played games. He was, by every visible metric, exactly the prodigy his mentor had insisted he could become. But beneath the visible triumphs, quieter currents moved. He struggled, more than his teachers realized, or perhaps more than they allowed themselves to acknowledge, with the emotional discipline the Order demanded. He felt too much, too strongly, and he had never been taught, in those crucial early years before slavery and grief shaped him, how to hold those feelings without being consumed by them. His bond with his mentor deepened into something resembling brotherhood, filled with genuine affection, but also strained by an undercurrent of resentment on both sides. The teacher felt the burden of an assignment he had never asked for, layered atop the grief of losing his own mentor far too soon. The student felt, at times, that he was perpetually falling short of expectations he had never fully understood, chasing a version of mastery that always seemed to recede just out of reach. The two of them traveled together across countless worlds during those years, sharing cramped quarters aboard star cruisers, sharing meals in dusty cantinas on the edges of civilized space, sharing the particular intimacy that grows between two people who have repeatedly saved each other's lives. There was real love between them, the kind that does not require constant articulation to be genuine, expressed instead through small gestures, through the reflexive way each moved to protect the other in moments of danger, through inside jokes that developed over years of shared hardship. And yet beneath that genuine affection ran a persistent current of miscommunication that neither of them seemed able to fully bridge. The teacher, still young himself, and still grieving his own mentor, often erred toward caution and restraint. worried that too much praise might inflate an already prodigious ego, worried that acknowledging the true scale of his students' gifts might feed exactly the kind of pride the order warned against. The student, starved for validation in ways his teacher never fully grasped, interpreted this caution as withheld affection, as evidence that no matter what he achieved, no matter how many lives he saved or battles he won, he would never quite be enough in his mentor's eyes. It was a tragic asymmetry of communication. Two people who loved each other deeply, each convinced the other doubted them, neither willing to voice that fear plainly enough for the misunderstanding to dissolve. Small wounds like this accumulate over years the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a riverbed, invisible day to day, yet eventually forming a foundation that shapes everything built upon it. He also struggled, in ways few around him fully appreciated, with the Order's broader philosophy regarding emotional detachment, where his peers, raised from infancy within the Order's walls, had been gently and gradually taught to release fear and attachment before those feelings ever calcified into something more permanent. He arrived already carrying years of lived experience, a childhood shaped by hardship no younger initiate had ever known. Asking him to simply release his fear for the people he loved felt, to him, less like liberation and more like erasure, as though the Order wanted him to excise the very parts of himself that connected him most deeply to his own humanity. He nodded along in meditation sessions, recited the appropriate teachings when asked, and performed, outwardly, the calm equanimity his training demanded. But privately, in the quiet hours between missions, he continued to love fiercely, fear deeply, and grieve openly for losses the Order insisted he should have already released. He was, in this sense, living a kind of quiet, double life, years before his more dramatic and consequential secrets began, practicing the art of concealment, long before concealment became the central architecture of his undoing. He carried, too, a secret sorrow that never left him. The fate of his mother, still enslaved on that distant desert world, growing more distant with each passing year of training that kept him elsewhere, occupied with duties and missions that mattered enormously to the galaxy, and, in his quieter moments, seemed to matter very little compared to the ache of not knowing whether she was safe, whether she was suffering, whether she was even still alive. He dreamed of her sometimes, vivid and troubling dreams that felt less like ordinary sleep and more like the Force itself trying to tell him something urgent. He would wake from these dreams with his heart pounding, and he would say nothing to his teachers, because the Order had taught him, both explicitly and through countless subtle cues, that fear for the people we love was a weakness to be mastered rather than a truth to be honored. It was during a mission that finally brought him back to that desert world, years after he had left it, that the wound he had carried silently for so long finally tore fully open. He learned upon arrival that his mother had eventually been freed and had married, had built something resembling a stable life for herself. In the years since he had last seen her, for a fleeting, beautiful moment, it seemed as though fate might finally offer him something uncomplicated. A joyful reunion, proof that the sacrifice of his childhood departure had not been in vain. But that hope collapsed almost as quickly as it arrived. She had been taken, he learned, captured by a group of desert raiders known for their brutality toward outsiders, and held for what turned out to be an agonizingly long stretch of time before he could reach her. When he finally found her, she was barely alive, her body broken by captivity and abuse, and she died in his arms. Only moments after he arrived, her final words, a quiet, heartbreaking assurance that she was proud of him, that she loved him, that everything, somehow, would be all right now that he was there. What happened next has been described many ways by many different voices across the galaxy. But stripped of euphemism, the truth is this: he slaughtered every single member of that raiding community he could find. Not soldiers in a battle, not combatants who posed him any threat. Men, women, children, every living being in that camp, cut down in an explosion of grief and rage, so total that he later confessed to the only person he trusted enough to tell that he did not think he had ever felt so consumed by anything in his life, and that some small, horrified part of him had almost enjoyed it. It was the first time the darkness inside him fully surfaced, unrestrained by any Jedi discipline, unmoderated by any of the careful emotional training his order had tried and failed to fully instill. He buried his mother beneath that alien sky, and he buried, alongside her, any illusion that he was simply an ordinary Jedi, struggling with ordinary doubts. Something had cracked inside him that day, a fault line that would never fully close, no matter how many victories or accolades or moments of genuine heroism came afterward to paper over it. He returned to his companions that night with sand still clinging to his robes and blood he had not fully washed away, staining his hands. And he confessed what he had done in a voice that trembled between shame and something far more unsettling. A flicker of justification, a whisper of belief that they had somehow deserved it, that his rage had been righteous even as his methods had been monstrous. The person he confessed to, the woman he loved, listened without condemnation, offering comfort instead of judgment. And though her compassion was genuine and born of real love for him, it also, in that critical moment, taught him something dangerous: that the people closest to him would forgive him almost anything, that love could function as a kind of absolution even for acts that deserved none. He buried that day deep inside himself afterward, rarely speaking of it again, but it never truly left him. It became, instead, a private proof of concept, evidence tucked away in the darkest corner of his memory, that when grief and rage grew large enough, he was capable of setting aside every value he claimed to hold in service of pure, annihilating vengeance. Years later, when a much greater and much more calculated betrayal called upon exactly that same capacity, the precedent had already been set, quietly, on that sand, beside his mother's grave. Around this same fragile period of his life, he met and fell irrevocably in love with a young political leader he had first encountered years earlier as a child, back when she had been a young queen fighting to protect her homeworld, and he had been nothing more than a slave boy dreaming of the stars. Their reunion, years later, reignited something neither of them had expected, or, in her case, entirely wanted. She was disciplined, principled, deeply devoted to her responsibilities, and initially resistant to the idea of falling for a man forbidden by his own order's code from forming exactly this kind of attachment. He was persistent, passionate, and increasingly incapable of separating what he wanted from what he was permitted to have. Their romance unfolded against the backdrop of a galaxy sliding steadily toward war, stolen conversations and secret glances evolving, gradually, and then all at once, into something neither of them could deny. They married in secret, a small and quiet ceremony witnessed by only a handful of trusted friends, a union that violated the deepest tenets of the order he had sworn his life to, and that, had it been discovered, would very likely have ended his career, if not his life, within that order entirely. For a brief window afterward, life offered him something he had almost never known. A sense of wholeness, a private world where he did not have to be the prodigy, the weapon, the chosen one burdened with prophecy, but simply a husband, quietly and completely devoted to the woman beside him. Those stolen moments, snatched between deployments and diplomatic crises, became the closest thing to peace he ever experienced as an adult, and he clung to them with an intensity that, in hindsight, revealed just how starved he had been for uncomplicated love his entire life. She, for her part, saw in him something the wider galaxy rarely got to witness beneath the armor of duty and destiny: a tenderness, a playfulness, a capacity for genuine joy that softened, if only briefly, the hardened edges his years of war and loss had carved into him. She believed, with the particular conviction of someone deeply in love, that she could reach the parts of him no one else could reach, that her love might be the anchor strong enough to hold him steady no matter what storms came. It was a beautiful belief. It would also, in time, prove tragically insufficient against the forces gathering to pull him under. She, meanwhile, carried her own version of this double existence, though hers was rooted in principle rather than forbidden romance alone. As the war dragged on, she grew increasingly disturbed by the erosion of democratic norms happening around her in the Senate, watching with mounting alarm as emergency powers accumulated in the hands of the very chancellor who had once been her own trusted ally, watching civil liberties quietly suspended in the name of wartime necessity, watching colleagues who once championed peace grow silent or complicit as the machinery of centralized power expanded unchecked. She organized quietly and at real personal risk, with a small circle of like-minded senators determined to resist this drift toward authoritarianism, unaware that the architect of everything she feared was the same man her husband had come to trust above almost anyone else in the galaxy. The two of them, husband and wife, were thus moving unknowingly toward the same catastrophe from two entirely different directions, one drawn toward its center by love and desperation, the other pushing against its edges by conscience and principle, and neither fully understood how close their two private struggles actually stood to converging into a single, shared tragedy. The secrecy itself became a kind of poison, slow-acting but relentless. Every day he lived as husband to a woman his order forbade him from loving was another day spent lying to the very people who trusted him most. Another brick laid in a wall of concealment that separated him further and further from the community that might otherwise have helped him navigate his growing turmoil. He could not confide in his fellow Jedi about his marriage. He could not seek counsel about the fear that gripped him whenever he imagined losing her, a fear that grew more intense and more specific as the months passed. He was, in every meaningful sense, alone with the two most powerful forces working on his psyche: an unspoken marriage he had to hide from everyone, and a darkness inside him that had already proven, on that desert sand beside his mother's grave. Exactly how far it could go when given the chance. The galaxy around him, meanwhile, was unraveling. What had once been centuries of relative peace and prosperity began fracturing into open conflict. A massive war erupting between the vast governing republic and a coalition of star systems seeking to break away from it entirely. The Jedi, traditionally peacekeepers and mediators rather than soldiers, found themselves thrust reluctantly into the role of generals, commanding vast armies of cloned soldiers bred specifically for war. He rose through this conflict with startling speed, becoming one of the most celebrated military commanders of the entire war, a hero whose exploits were broadcast and celebrated across countless worlds. He led daring rescues, orchestrated brilliant tactical victories, and inspired fierce loyalty among the soldiers who served under him, many of whom would later describe him as the finest commanding officer they had ever known. A man who fought alongside his troops rather than merely directing them from safety, who grieved every loss under his command as though it were personal, because to him it always was. But war does something to even the most idealistic soul. And years of relentless combat, of watching friends and comrades die in staggering numbers, of making impossible decisions under impossible pressure, wore away at whatever remained of the innocent boy who had once dreamed simply of freedom and adventure among the stars. He grew harder. He grew more willing to bend or break the careful ethical codes his order demanded, believing increasingly that results mattered more than methods, that the ends of victory and protection justified whatever means were required to achieve them. This shift culminated, publicly and unmistakably, in an act that shocked even his closest allies. During a pivotal confrontation late in the war, he executed a defeated, disarmed enemy leader in cold blood, a former Jedi turned adversary who had been captured and rendered helpless. The moments leading up to that execution matter as much as the act itself. The captured enemy leader, kneeling and disarmed, had just revealed, almost as a taunt, that the entire war both sides were fighting had been orchestrated from its very beginning by a single, unseen mastermind, manipulating events from within the highest levels of the Republic government, a revelation that should have been treated as urgent, galaxy-altering intelligence. Instead, in the charged, chaotic aftermath of battle, with rage and adrenaline and years of accumulated grief still surging through him, the young Jedi looked down at his defeated adversary, felt something ancient and furious rise up inside him, remembered perhaps, without fully realizing it, the sand-covered rage of that other massacre years earlier, and struck. It happened in an instant, faster than restraint could intervene, and it left his closest friend and mentor standing beside him in stunned, horrified silence, staring at a version of his former student he barely recognized. Neither man spoke of it again in any depth afterward. It became one more secret, folded quietly into an already overcrowded collection of things left unaddressed, unprocessed, and unhealed, each one a small crack spreading further across a foundation already dangerously compromised. It was an execution, not a battle. Carried out in a moment of fury, he later struggled to fully explain even to himself. His closest friend and mentor, present for the act, watched in stunned silence, recognizing in that moment that something fundamental had shifted in the man he had trained, something that traditional Jedi correction might no longer be capable of reaching. The war itself deserves its own reckoning here, because it is impossible to understand what became of him without understanding what that endless, grinding conflict did to nearly everyone who fought in it. It was a war built, unbeknownst to almost every participant on either side, entirely upon manipulation, engineered from its very inception by the same hidden mastermind who was simultaneously guiding galactic politics from within the highest office in the Republic. Countless beings died in that war for a cause that was, in the truest sense, a fabrication, a controlled catastrophe designed solely to accumulate power for a single architect pulling strings from the shadows. The young Jedi commander at the center of our story fought campaign after campaign with total sincerity, believing every sacrifice meaningful, every battle a genuine step toward peace, never once suspecting that the entire conflict was theater, that the deaths piling up around him, including the deaths of soldiers who called him friend and brother, were simply fuel for someone else's ambition. He formed bonds during that war, unlike any he had known before, particularly with the cloned soldiers under his command, beings created and bred for war who nonetheless developed individual personalities, individual dreams, individual fears, despite a galaxy that too often treated them as disposable. He fought to protect them as fiercely as he fought to protect anyone. And watching them die, campaign after campaign, in a war he did not yet know was manufactured, carved grooves of grief and fury into him that ran deeper with every passing engagement. He began, gradually, to develop a reputation among both allies and enemies as someone whose battlefield conduct occasionally strayed from the restrained, disciplined ideal his order espoused. He took risks other commanders would not take, not from recklessness, but from a growing conviction that caution cost lives, that decisive, sometimes brutal action saved more people in the long run than patient adherence to rules written by beings who had never stood in the mud and fire of actual combat. His fellow Jedi, watching from a certain remove, worried quietly about this evolution, without quite knowing how to address it, uncertain whether they were witnessing the emergence of a truly great warrior, forging new methods for a new kind of war, or the early tremors of something considerably more troubling. Both interpretations, it would turn out, were correct simultaneously, and that duality, greatness and danger, fused into a single inseparable whole, defined nearly everything about him from that point forward. A particular grievance from this period lodged itself especially deep, one he would return to quietly, again and again, in the months that followed. Despite his extraordinary record of service, despite battlefield accomplishments that outshone nearly every other Jedi of his generation, the Council declined to elevate him to the highest rank an accomplished knight could achieve, granting him instead a seat on their governing body without the accompanying title and recognition that traditionally came with such a position. Their reasoning, delivered with the same careful, well-intentioned caution that had shadowed him since childhood, centered on concerns about his temperament, his attachments, his still unfinished journey toward the emotional mastery they required of their most senior members. To the Council, it was a measured, defensible decision, consistent with principles they had upheld for centuries. To the young man standing before them, it read as one more confirmation of a lifelong pattern, recognized for his usefulness, his power, his battlefield value. yet perpetually withheld the full trust and belonging. He craved more than any title could satisfy. He accepted the compromise outwardly, bowed to their decision as protocol demanded, and carried the wound inward, where it joined every other unaddressed grievance quietly compounding beneath a composed and dutiful exterior. Layered atop all of this, a new and devastating source of terror began infiltrating his sleep. He began experiencing vivid, recurring visions of his wife dying. Images so specific and so viscerally terrifying that he woke from them shaking, drenched in sweat, gripped by a dread that followed him through every waking hour that followed. These were not ordinary nightmares, born of stress or exhaustion. As a being uniquely attuned to the currents of the Force, he had learned, through painful prior experience, that his dreams sometimes carried genuine prophetic weight. He had dreamed once before of his mother's suffering, and that suffering had proven horrifyingly real. Now he dreamed of his wife dying in childbirth, and he became consumed, almost overnight, by a singular, desperate need to find some way, any way, to prevent that vision from becoming reality as well. He could not lose another person he loved to a fate he had foreseen and failed to stop. The thought was unbearable to him in a way that superseded every other consideration in his life, including, eventually, his loyalty to the very order that had raised him. Night after night, the same vision returned to him with cruel consistency, refining itself in detail each time, as though the Force itself were sharpening the blade it intended eventually to use against him. He saw her in pain. He saw her calling his name in a voice stripped of its usual composure, raw, with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show the wider galaxy. He saw himself, again and again, arriving too late, powerless, despite all his extraordinary abilities to stop what was happening, forced to watch helplessly, as the one person who had given his life genuine meaning outside of duty and prophecy slipped away from him entirely. He would wake gasping in the dark, reach instinctively for her even when they were apart, and spend the following hours consumed by a dread so total it colored every interaction, every mission, every quiet moment of supposed peace. He confided in no one within his order about these visions, certain that admitting their content would mean admitting the marriage itself, and terrified besides that, speaking the vision aloud within Jedi walls might somehow make its fulfillment more certain rather than less. He carried it entirely alone, a private apocalypse ticking steadily towards some unknown but certain hour. And the isolation of that burden did more damage to him, in its own quiet way, than almost any single external event in his entire life. Grief anticipated is sometimes heavier than grief experienced, because anticipated grief never resolves, never permits the slow processing that eventually allows a wound to close. It simply accumulates day after day, a weight that grows and grows with no release valve in sight, until the person carrying it becomes willing to consider almost anything, however drastic, however forbidden, that might finally make it stop. It was into this precise fracture, this perfect storm of grief, secrecy, terror, and moral erosion, that a patient and calculating figure began, slowly and with extraordinary skill, to insert himself. This figure held one of the highest political offices in the entire galaxy. a position of immense trust and influence, and had cultivated over many years a warm, almost paternal relationship with the young Jedi, one that felt, to the young man, refreshingly different from the more reserved and rule-bound relationships he maintained with his actual mentors and peers within the Order. This political figure listened without judgment. He offered sympathy where the Jedi Council offered discipline. He validated frustrations that the Order dismissed as attachment or fear, to be released rather than legitimate grievances to be honored. And crucially, he began, with exquisite subtlety, planting seeds of doubt about the very philosophy that had shaped the young man's entire life, suggesting gently that perhaps the Jedi's rigid rejection of emotion and attachment was not wisdom at all, but a kind of self-imposed blindness, a refusal to grapple honestly with the full spectrum of what it meant to be a living, feeling being. What the young Jedi did not know, could not have known, was that this trusted friend and mentor figure was, in secret, the very embodiment of the ancient darkness the Jedi had spent centuries believing extinguished. A master of the forbidden arts, the Jedi feared above all else. A practitioner of philosophies built entirely around embracing passion, ambition, and power rather than releasing them. This figure had spent years, patient beyond ordinary comprehension, orchestrating the very war now tearing the galaxy apart, manipulating both sides of the conflict toward outcomes that served a single, hidden purpose: the consolidation of absolute personal power and the eventual destruction of the very order he had spent decades pretending to serve and admire. The manipulation, when examined closely, reveals itself as a masterwork of patience rather than force, a slow accumulation of small trusts rather than any single dramatic act of persuasion. It began years earlier, long before the war, with simple gestures of kindness toward a lonely, homesick boy freshly arrived from slavery, an attentive ear, a genuine, seeming interest in his well-being, small favors extended, without any apparent expectation of return. Over time, those gestures deepened into something resembling genuine mentorship, conversations that ranged across politics, philosophy, history, and eventually, with exquisite gradualness, the nature of power itself. The older man never pushed too hard, never revealed too much too soon, content instead to plant single seeds of doubt here and there and allow the young man's own mind, already primed by grief and isolation and the accumulated frustrations of Jedi restraint, to nurture those seeds into something larger entirely on its own. He praised the young man's individuality at moments when the Jedi Council offered only caution. He validated feelings of being underappreciated at moments when the young man's closest friend and mentor, however lovingly, offered only measured restraint instead of full-throated recognition. He spoke, increasingly over the years, of the Jedi's philosophy as noble but ultimately limited, a philosophy built around denial rather than mastery, suggesting always, without ever quite stating outright, that true power required embracing the full spectrum of feeling rather than suppressing half of it in the name of discipline. By the time the war reached its most desperate hours, this relationship had become the single most trusted bond in the young man's entire life. More trusted, in certain painful respects, than his relationship with his own former teacher. More trusted even than his marriage, if only because it was the one relationship he never had to hide, the one place he could speak freely about fear and frustration and grief, without immediately confronting the tangled complications Those admissions triggered everywhere else in his carefully compartmentalized existence. He never suspected, not truly, not until circumstances forced the truth into the open, that the warmth he felt from this friendship was being calculated with the same cold precision a strategist applies to a military campaign, that every reassuring word, every moment of validation, every carefully timed act of apparent generosity had been selected and deployed with a single, patient, decades-long objective in mind. It is perhaps the cruelest irony of the entire tragedy that the one relationship in his adult life that felt, to him, entirely uncomplicated and safe, was in fact the most dangerous relationship he had ever entered. A trap so gently constructed that its walls were invisible even as they closed slowly, inexorably, around him. And at the center of his elaborate scheme sat the young man he had spent years quietly grooming. A being of unprecedented power, whose skills, properly redirected, could accomplish what centuries of patient Sith plotting alone never could. The revelation, when it finally arrived in stages rather than all at once. Rumors and suspicions had circulated for some time about a hidden mastermind orchestrating events from behind the scenes of the war. A shadowy figure, the Jedi Council increasingly suspected, might be embedded somewhere near the very heart of galactic government. The young Jedi, torn between his genuine affection for his political mentor and his oath of loyalty to the order that had raised him, found himself unwittingly placed at the exact center of this unfolding crisis, asked by his own council to monitor the very man who had become, in the absence of anyone else he could fully confide in, something close to a father figure. And when the truth was finally, undeniably revealed to him directly, spoken aloud by the very man he had trusted with his deepest fears, it did not arrive as a clean moment of clarity. It arrived instead as devastating confirmation of something he had perhaps sensed on some buried level, for longer than he wanted to admit, that the figure who understood him best, who had never once judged him for his fear or his love or his rage, was also the architect of unfathomable evil, and was now offering him, with terrifying sincerity, the one thing he wanted more desperately than anything else in the galaxy: the power, he claimed, to prevent death itself, to save the woman he loved from the fate he had already foreseen in his dreams. The room where this confession finally occurred was, by all outward appearances, unremarkable. A private box overlooking a grand performance hall, the kind of quietly luxurious setting where galactic elites conducted business behind a veneer of culture and entertainment. And yet within its walls, the entire trajectory of a life, and in many ways the entire trajectory of a galaxy, pivoted on a conversation conducted in hushed, careful tones. The older man spoke of an ancient legend, a story passed down through generations of dark side practitioners, of a figure so attuned to the deepest, most forbidden currents of the Force that he had learned to cheat death itself, to preserve consciousness beyond the failure of the body, even to influence the very processes of life and death in others. It was, he suggested gently, exactly the kind of knowledge that could save someone from a fate as terrible as the one haunting the young man's dreams. The young Jedi listened with his heart pounding, torn between horror at what he was hearing and a desperate, humiliating hope that refused to be silenced no matter how firmly his training told him it should be. He asked questions he knew he should not ask. He lingered in the conversation, longer than loyalty to his order should have permitted. And when the true identity of the man speaking to him was finally, unavoidably revealed, confirmed by his own admission, delivered without a flicker of shame or hesitation, the young man's entire understanding of his own life collapsed and rebuilt itself within the span of a few devastating heartbeats. He stood, in that moment, at the exact center of the widest fracture a soul can experience. Everything he had been taught screaming at him to resist, to report the truth to the council, to trust in the order, and the philosophy that had shaped his entire adult life, set directly against everything he feared and loved, screaming just as loudly that only this forbidden path, this dangerous and dark and utterly seductive offer, could save the person whose loss he could not survive. He had spent his entire life since childhood accumulating losses he had been powerless to prevent. His freedom taken and only partially restored. His mother enslaved and then murdered before he could properly save her. His sense of belonging perpetually complicated by an order that both saved and doubted him in equal measure. Now, finally, someone was offering him a way to ensure that the next loss, the one he feared most of all, would never have to happen. He did not yet know, standing at that threshold, that the price of accepting such an offer would ultimately cost him not just his connection to the order, not just his identity, not just his soul in any meaningful sense of the word, but the very thing he was so desperately trying to save. Those closest to him had begun, in the weeks and days leading up to this moment, to sense that something in him had shifted, even if none of them could name precisely what. His former teacher, still bonded to him through years of shared history despite the strains that had grown between them, felt an unfamiliar coldness creeping into their conversations, a distance he attributed, charitably, to the exhaustion of endless war rather than anything more sinister. His wife noticed it too, in smaller, more intimate ways. A new sharpness in his voice during arguments, a growing tendency to speak of control and power in place of the patience and hope that had once defined him, a haunted quality behind his eyes that no amount of reassurance from her seemed able to fully dispel. Even the small, wise being who had first warned the council of the dangers within him all those years earlier felt a disturbance ripple through the force itself during this period, a disturbance he could not yet trace to its source, but which left him profoundly uneasy, certain that something significant and likely catastrophic was gathering just beyond the edge of his perception. None of them, not his teacher, not his wife, not even the wisest member of an order built specifically around sensing such disturbances, arrived in time to intervene before the threshold was crossed. Whether anything could have stopped what came next is a question the galaxy would spend generations debating, turning the tragedy over and over in search of the single moment where it might have been prevented, never quite settling on an answer that offered any comfort at all. What makes this particular juncture so unbearably tragic, more than any single decision that followed it, is how ordinary the emotions driving him actually were. Fear for a loved one. Grief for a mother lost too soon. Resentment at feeling perpetually undervalued despite extraordinary sacrifice. Loneliness born of years spent hiding his truest self from nearly everyone around him. These are not exotic evils. They are the quiet, universal aches carried by countless beings across countless worlds. The same aches that visit ordinary hearts in ordinary lives. What made his case so catastrophic was not the strangeness of his pain, but the terrifying scale of power available to a being who happened to be carrying it, power that could, in the wrong configuration, reshape the fate of an entire galaxy. An ordinary being crushed beneath grief and fear might lash out at those nearest them, might withdraw into isolation, might make choices they regret for the rest of an otherwise unremarkable life. This particular being, gifted or cursed with abilities beyond nearly any other soul in recorded history, stood at the same breaking point every grieving heart eventually reaches, except that his breaking point carried the gravitational pull to bend the trajectory of everything around him. That is the terrible lesson embedded at the heart of this story, one worth carrying gently into sleep tonight. Pain deferred and unprocessed does not simply vanish with time. It waits, it accumulates, and it will, eventually, demand to be reckoned with, one way or another. The choice that stood before him was not, in truth, a single decision made in a single instant. However, the galaxy would later choose to remember it. It was the culmination of every wound left unhealed, every grief left unspoken, every fear the Order had asked him to release rather than helping him process, every attachment he had been told to abandon rather than taught how to hold with wisdom instead of desperation. He stood at the edge of the darkest choice of his life, carrying the weight of every choice that had come before it. And though the galaxy would soon watch him fall in ways that seemed sudden and shocking from the outside, the truth, understood from within his own heart, was that he had been falling, slowly and quietly, and almost imperceptibly, for a very long time already. The next chapter of this story carries the fall itself, the moment when everything held back for so long finally breaks loose entirely, and the galaxy watches a hero become the very darkness he once swore to destroy. Rest here for now, in this quiet space, just before the point of no return, and when you are ready, the rest of the story will be waiting. He knelt. That single, simple, physical act, a body lowering itself before another, in a gesture as old as servitude itself, became the hinge upon which an entire galaxy's fate would turn. He had spent his whole life being told what he might become, prophesied about, debated over, measured against expectations he never fully chose for himself. And in this moment, kneeling in a dim office overlooking a city that never slept, he finally, actively chose something entirely his own. It did not feel, in that instant, like surrender. It felt, to him, like the first truly decisive act of his adult life, an assertion of will against a fate that had always seemed to be happening to him rather than something he shaped himself. He would understand only much later, and only after losing almost everything that mattered to him, how thoroughly he had been played, how the choice he believed was his alone had in fact been engineered with exquisite patience across years of careful manipulation. But in that dim office, none of that mattered yet. All that mattered was the promise dangling before him. Power enough, finally, to save the one person he could not bear to lose. He received, in that same quiet ceremony, a new name, a name meant to mark the death of the man he had been and the birth of something the galaxy had never seen before, an instrument of the dark side, wrapped in unprecedented raw power. The name itself carried weight, chosen deliberately to evoke both menace and mourning. A title that would come to inspire terror across 1,000 worlds within days of being spoken for the first time. And with that new name came new orders. Orders so vast in their cruelty that even his master seemed to understand instinctively that only total commitment, delivered swiftly and without pause for reflection, could carry his new apprentice across the threshold before doubt had any chance to intervene. He was sent, first, to confront the very Jedi Council that had raised him, doubted him, and ultimately failed to save him from the darkness now consuming him whole. What followed unfolded with a speed that left no room for the slow reckoning such a rupture deserved. Elsewhere across the galaxy, in a single coordinated instant, an ancient and terrible directive buried within the obedient minds of every cloned soldier serving under Jedi command activated all at once, a hidden command implanted years earlier by the same architect of manipulation, now standing at the center of everything. Soldiers who had fought beside their Jedi generals for years, who had bled alongside them, mourned alongside them, in many cases genuinely loved them as brothers in arms, turned their weapons on those same generals without warning, compelled by programming buried so deep in their conditioning that resistance was, for nearly all of them, simply impossible. Across countless worlds simultaneously, Jedi who had spent the war believing themselves surrounded by loyal comrades fell, instead to betrayal delivered by the very hands they trusted most, cut down mid-battle, mid-conversation, mid-embrace, with no warning and almost no chance to defend themselves. It remains one of the single most devastating acts of coordinated betrayal in the galaxy's entire recorded history. A betrayal made all the more horrifying by the fact that the soldiers carrying it out were, in the truest sense, victims themselves. Puppets whose strings had been fixed in place long before they ever had any say in the matter. He, meanwhile, led his own portion of this horror directly into the heart of the very temple that had raised him from a frightened, grieving child into a warrior the galaxy had once celebrated as a hero. He walked those familiar halls he had once wandered as a boy, still learning to hold a training blade, halls where he had laughed with friends, meditated beside masters who had shaped his understanding of the universe, grown from uncertain child into celebrated knight. And he walked them now as an instrument of their destruction, leading soldiers under his command in a systematic purge of everyone who remained inside, without mercy, without hesitation, following an order he had accepted in exchange for a promise he did not yet fully understand, could never actually be kept. Among those who remained inside that day were children, the youngest initiates of the order, too small and too newly arrived to have been sent away to safer postings elsewhere in the galaxy, too innocent to understand what was unfolding around them beyond a vague and rapidly escalating terror. What he did inside those walls that day would follow him, in whatever fractured remnant of conscience survived within him, for the rest of his existence, a wound so deep that even decades later, glimpses of memory from that single afternoon could still shake loose whatever fragile stability he had constructed around himself in the years since. He told himself, in the moment and for a long time afterward, that this was necessary, that this was the price of the power he needed, that grief deferred indefinitely eventually stops feeling like grief at all and starts, instead, to feel like duty. It was, in truth, simply denial wearing the mask of resolve, a mask that would eventually crack under weight it was never built to bear. Across the wider galaxy, the purge continued with mechanical, horrifying efficiency. Jedi who had spent generations serving as guardians of peace mediators of conflict, protectors of the vulnerable, fell one by one, scattered across 1,000 different battlefields, most of them dying without ever understanding why the soldiers beside them had suddenly turned to kill them, without ever learning that the entire war they had fought so faithfully had been manufactured from its very beginning, specifically to create this single, catastrophic moment. Only a small handful escaped the purge entirely, scattered and hunted, forced into hiding across the furthest, most forgotten corners of civilized space, carrying with them the last living memory of an order that had endured for 1,000 generations, and had been, within the span of a single coordinated afternoon, all but extinguished. Word of the temple's fall reached the woman he loved before he did. Delivered second-hand through channels twisted just enough by distance and fear to leave her uncertain what exactly had happened, only that something catastrophic had occurred, and that the man she loved had been at the center of it. She traveled to find him carrying a desperate, aching hope that whatever had happened, some explanation would emerge that did not require her to believe the worst about the person she had built an entire secret life around loving. She found him instead on a distant, volcanic world, a place of fire and ash that seemed almost designed by fate to serve as backdrop for whatever confrontation was coming, and the man who greeted her there was recognizable in body, but already in ways she could not yet fully articulate. Someone profoundly and irreversibly different from the husband she had married in secret years earlier. Their reunion, which should have offered relief after so much fear and uncertainty, instead became the final, unbearable rupture of everything between them. He spoke to her with a conviction that startled and frightened her, insisting that he had done what was necessary to protect her, to protect their unborn child, to secure enough power to ensure they would never again have to fear losing anyone they loved. He wanted her to see the strength he had claimed as a gift rather than a horror. Wanted her, more than anything, to stand beside him as he reshaped the galaxy into something he believed, with the terrible sincerity of a man drowning in denial, would finally be safe. She could not give him what he wanted. She looked at him, this man she loved beyond reason, and saw not the safety he promised, but a stranger wearing a face she recognized. Someone consumed by exactly the kind of fear and darkness she had spent years quietly worrying, might one day claim him entirely. Her horror, honest and unconcealed, reached him not as the concern of someone who loved him, but as confirmation of his deepest, oldest fear, that even the person who knew him most completely would ultimately see him as something to be feared rather than someone to be trusted. What happened next has been recounted so many times, in so many forms, across so many corners of the galaxy, that it has taken on the weight of legend rather than simple history. His former mentor, the man who had raised him from an inexperienced Padawan into one of the finest warriors the Jedi Order had ever produced, arrived on that same volcanic world, having stowed away with the singular, desperate hope of somehow reaching his former student before violence became inevitable. What he found instead broke something in him nearly as profound as whatever had already broken in the man standing before him. Accusations flew between them, decades of unspoken resentment and unprocessed grief finally surfacing all at once. Each man convinced the other had failed him, in ways neither could fully articulate, even now. The confrontation that followed was not merely a duel of skill. Though both men fought with a mastery few in the galaxy's history could have matched. It was a duel between two versions of the same broken heart. One that had chosen fear and control, one that had chosen restraint and duty, each utterly certain the other had chosen wrong, neither able to reach the other across a gulf of grief too vast for words to bridge. The battle raged across that volcanic landscape with a ferocity that mirrored the emotional devastation driving it. Two men who had once trusted each other completely, now trying, in genuine earnest, to kill one another, surrounded by rivers of molten rock and skies choked with ash. A setting so viscerally hellish that it seemed to mock the beauty of everything they had once shared together. In the end, one man's superior tactical position, born of the sheer geographical advantage the terrain offered him, proved decisive where raw power alone could not. The former student, overconfident in his newfound strength, made a critical misjudgment, and his former teacher, weeping even as he did it, delivered a blow that should have ended the confrontation permanently, severing the last physical connection his former student had to the man he had once been, and leaving him broken and burning on the black volcanic shore, consumed by flames that would sear away nearly everything human about him that still remained. He did not die there, though for a long, terrible stretch afterward, death would surely have been the mercy he deserved more than what actually awaited him. His new master, the architect of every tragedy that had led to this exact moment, arrived not out of compassion, but out of calculated investment, unwilling to lose an asset of such immense and rare power to something as simple as untreated wounds. What remained of the man was gathered, broken, and barely alive, and delivered into the hands of medical technology capable of sustaining life within a body that had been all but destroyed. What emerged from that process, weeks later, was no longer recognizable as the passionate, gifted, deeply loving young man who had once dreamed of freedom on a distant desert world. Encased permanently within a suit of black armor necessary simply to keep him breathing, his face and body scarred beyond any hope of restoration, his voice transformed into something mechanical and inhuman, he became, in every visible and audible way, exactly the monster the galaxy would soon learn to fear above all others. And in the cruelest twist, yet in a story already defined by cruel twists, he learned, upon waking within that new mechanical prison of a body, that his desperate gamble had cost him precisely the thing he had sacrificed everything to save, the woman he loved. Having survived the confrontation on that volcanic world, only to be brought before healers who found, to their genuine bewilderment, nothing physically wrong with her that should have threatened her life, simply began to fade, slipping away with a gentleness that stood in stark, heartbreaking contrast to the violence that had precipitated it. The healers who attended her had no medical explanation to offer, no injury or illness to point toward, only the quiet, devastating observation that she seemed, in some way, medicine could not measure or treat, to have lost the will to continue living, her heart broken beyond what her body could sustain. She lived long enough to bring 2 children safely into the galaxy, twins who would carry forward, in ways neither parent could have foreseen, the hope that had died alongside her. And in her final moments, she spoke words of stubborn, aching faith, insisting that there remained good in the man she had married, even now, even after everything, a faith that the galaxy would not see vindicated for many long years still to come. he was told, in the aftermath, a lie crafted specifically to complete his transformation into something wholly loyal and wholly broken, that his own actions, his own rage, had killed her, that he alone bore responsibility for the death of the one person his entire fall had been engineered to save. It was not, in fact, the whole truth, though grief and violence had certainly played their part in a heart that simply could not bear what had been asked of it. But the lie served its purpose perfectly, driving whatever fragile remnant of the man he had been deep beneath layers of grief and self-loathing so total that the being who emerged from that devastation no longer resembled, in any meaningful psychological sense, the boy who had once wept leaving his mother behind on a desert world, or the young man who had once found genuine, uncomplicated joy in stolen moments with the woman he loved. What remained was something colder, harder, and almost entirely consumed by service to the very master who had orchestrated his ruin from the very beginning. The decades that followed unfolded with a bleak, grinding sameness that stood in stark contrast to the passionate, restless spirit that had once defined him. He became, in the eyes of the wider galaxy, an instrument of terror without equal, dispatched across countless worlds to enforce the will of the new order that had risen from the ashes of the Republic he had once sworn to protect. He hunted, with methodical, joyless efficiency, the scattered remnants of the very order that had raised him, tracking down survivors of the purge he himself had helped orchestrate, extinguishing whatever small embers of hope and resistance still flickered in the galaxy's darkest corners. There was no pleasure in this work for him, whatever the wider galaxy might have assumed watching from a safe distance. There was only obedience, a grim and total submission to a master who ruled through fear rather than loyalty, who reminded him, in ways subtle and overt alike, that his continued existence depended entirely on his usefulness, that any flicker of independent will beyond what served the Empire's purposes would be met with punishment swift and merciless. His relationship with his master during these years bore little resemblance to the warm, seemingly paternal bond that had first drawn him toward the dark side. Whatever affection had existed before the fall revealed itself, in the years that followed, as nothing more than a calculated performance, discarded the moment it was no longer necessary to secure his loyalty. He served now not out of love or even genuine belief in the cause he enforced, but out of a bleak, hollowed-out resignation, a conviction that he had already lost everything worth living for, and that servitude, however joyless, was simply the price of continuing to exist at all. He rarely spoke, in these years, of the life he had lived before the suit, before the mask, before the mechanical voice that replaced whatever warmth his own had once carried. Those who served under his command learned quickly that any mention of the war, of the Jedi Order, of anything connected to his life before the transformation, was met with a cold, dangerous silence that warned against further inquiry. He had, in effect, buried the man he had been so deeply that even he seemed uncertain, in his quieter moments, whether anything of that man still survived beneath the armor at all. And yet, buried as it was, something did survive. It surfaced only rarely, in flickers so brief and so quickly suppressed that few who witnessed them recognized what they were seeing. A moment of hesitation before an order he might once have questioned. A flash of something almost like grief when reports crossed his desk of atrocities carried out in service of an empire he had helped build. A restless, wordless unease whenever certain names from his old life surfaced in conversation. Names he never spoke aloud himself, but which seemed to land each time he heard them. Like small physical blows, he had trained himself not to visibly react to. He had constructed, across years of disciplined suppression, an almost impenetrable wall between the man he had been and the enforcer he had become, and that wall held, for the most part, remarkably well. But walls built from grief and denial rather than genuine healing are rarely as stable as they appear. And somewhere in the galaxy, unknown to him for many years, a single thread remained that would eventually prove strong enough to begin pulling that wall apart. The twins born in the chaos of his transformation had been separated at birth and hidden with extraordinary care, their very existence concealed not only from the galaxy at large, but deliberately and cruelly from their own father as well. Those responsible for their protection understood with painful clarity exactly what kind of danger their survival represented should their true parentage ever be discovered. And they judged, correctly as it turned out, that the safest path forward was total separation, total secrecy, and total distance from the man who might otherwise have sensed some flicker of connection to them across the currents of the Force. The daughter was raised amid privilege and purpose, adopted into a family of quiet nobility, and eventually drawn, as she grew, into the very resistance movements working to undo everything her father's service had helped build. The son was raised in obscurity, tucked away on the same harsh desert world where his father had once been born into slavery, an echo of origin neither father nor son understood as anything more than unhappy coincidence, until circumstances eventually forced the truth into the open. The boy grew up believing himself an orphan, raised by relatives who loved him, but who guarded the truth of his parentage as though it were a matter of life and death, which, in the most literal sense, it was. He dreamed, as his father once had, of a life larger than the one his desert world seemed to offer him, restless with a yearning he could not fully name, drawn toward adventure and purpose in ways that mirrored, without either of them realizing it, the same restless spirit that had once defined his father at the very same age. He possessed, too, without training or awareness, flickers of the same extraordinary connection to the Force that had made his father such an anomaly among Jedi and Sith alike, an inheritance neither chosen nor understood, waiting quietly beneath the surface of an otherwise unremarkable adolescence for the moment circumstances would finally call it forward. That moment arrived, as such moments often do, wrapped in tragedy. Violence found the boy's home and the people who had raised him, forcing him out into a galaxy far larger and far more dangerous than anything he had previously known, guided by an old, weathered stranger who turned out to be someone with a far deeper connection to his life than he could have possibly imagined. The same mentor who had once trained his father, living now in quiet, watchful exile on the very world where the boy had been hidden all those years, waiting, patiently and sorrowfully, for a moment he had hoped might never actually come. Under this old mentor's guidance, the boy began a journey that echoed his father's in ways almost too precise to be coincidence. Discovery of a gift for the Force he had never known he possessed, entanglement in a rebellion against the very empire his father now served, and eventually, inevitably, a confrontation with the very legacy he had spent his entire life unaware he carried. Their first encounter came amid chaos, a desperate battle between a small band of rebels and the overwhelming might of the empire he served, and neither father nor son yet understood the true nature of their connection to one another. The father sensed, in that confrontation, something curious and unsettling in the Force, a presence that felt oddly, achingly familiar in ways he could not immediately place, though he pushed the sensation aside, unwilling or perhaps unable to entertain the possibility his instincts were quietly suggesting. The son, for his part, knew only that he had witnessed something monstrous, a masked figure of terrifying power who cut down his own mentor, the old stranger who had guided him this far, in a duel that ended not with the old man's defeat, but with a strange, almost willing surrender. The mentor allowing himself to vanish into the Force itself rather than continue fighting, offering, with his final act, one last lesson about sacrifice that the son would spend years trying fully to understand. Word eventually reached the father, through channels both official and otherwise, that a young pilot bearing a name he recognized instantly and completely had been instrumental in a devastating rebel victory against the Empire's most fearsome weapon. A young pilot whose skill in that critical battle had displayed an uncanny, unmistakable connection to the Force. The name struck him with a force greater than any physical blow he had endured in years, unraveling in an instant the careful psychological walls he had spent so long constructing. A son, his son, alive, gifted, and now, however, unknowingly, standing directly in the crosshairs of the very empire his father had devoted his broken existence to serving. What followed was a slow, agonizing unraveling of everything he had told himself in order to survive the years since his transformation. A growing, undeniable awareness that the void he had spent so long trying to fill with obedience and power had, in fact, never truly been empty at all. Something of his old self, the version of him capable of love beyond all reason, had survived after all, dormant rather than destroyed, waiting only for something powerful enough to call it back into the light. He pursued his son across the galaxy in the years that followed with an intensity that masked, beneath its surface, a desperate and barely acknowledged longing, torn between his master's explicit orders to capture or destroy this dangerous new threat to the Empire's stability, and a private, unspoken hope that capture might offer him something he had not dared to want in a very long time. A chance, however slim, to know the child he had lost before he had ever truly gained him. Their confrontations grew more frequent and more fraught with each passing encounter, each meeting layered with a complexity neither man fully understood, the son sensing something in his adversary that felt less like simple villainy and more like a tragedy still unfolding. The father sensing in his son a spirit so achingly reminiscent of the boy he himself had once been, before slavery and grief and manipulation had reshaped him into something else entirely. The truth finally surfaced during a confrontation high above a floating city, built into the clouds of a distant gas giant, a duel that had begun as one more attempt at capture, and ended instead as the single most devastating revelation of the son's young life. Overpowered and grievously wounded in the fight, The young man clung desperately to a narrow ledge suspended above what seemed an endless, swirling abyss, refusing still, even in defeat, to accept the offer of power and partnership his masked adversary extended toward him. He had been told by the same old mentor who had died protecting him, and by another wise, diminutive teacher who had trained him further in the years since, that the man responsible for so much suffering across the galaxy, the very man now standing before him, had once been someone else entirely, a Jedi Knight who had fallen to darkness and betrayed everything he once stood for. He clung to a simple, righteous certainty that his own father, wherever he might be, had surely died the same day the Jedi Order itself had fallen, a martyr rather than a monster. That certainty shattered in an instant when his adversary spoke the words that would echo across the galaxy for generations afterward, revealing, without preamble or softness, that no such martyrdom had occurred, that the father the young man had spent his whole life imagining as a fallen hero stood, instead, directly before him, transformed but unmistakably alive, offering him now the very thing his father had once sacrificed. Everything trying to secure an alliance built on power, strong enough, he believed, to protect the people they loved from ever suffering loss again. The young man's horror in that moment mirrored, in painful and precise ways, the horror his mother had once felt on that volcanic world years earlier, confronted suddenly with the realization that someone she loved had become something she could barely recognize. He refused the offer with everything he had left, choosing instead to release his grip entirely and fall into the swirling unknown below, rather than accept partnership with the darkness his father now represented. A refusal born not of hatred, but of a desperate, aching love for a father he had never truly known, and a hope that man might still, somehow, be reachable. He survived that fall, rescued and returned eventually to his allies. But he carried the revelation forward from that day like a wound that refused to fully close, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Was the darkness in his father total and permanent, a corruption beyond any hope of reversal? Or did some flicker of the man his mother and his teachers had once known still survive somewhere beneath the armor and the myth and the terror the wider galaxy associated with that name? A hope he carried quietly and mostly alone, sharing it with almost no one for fear of being told, gently but firmly, that he was chasing a comfort the universe had no obligation to grant him. He found himself, in the months that followed, drawn increasingly toward a conviction his teachers explicitly warned him against, that he might be able to succeed where an entire order of Jedi across 1,000 generations had failed, that love and connection, rather than combat and destruction, might still offer some path toward redemption for the man responsible for so much suffering. His teachers cautioned him fiercely against this hope, warning that his father's fall had progressed too far, that any attempt at reconciliation risked pulling the son down into the same darkness rather than pulling the father back up into the light. The young man listened to these warnings with respect, but could not fully abandon the hope burning quietly beneath them, a hope that would eventually carry him into the single most consequential decision of his own young life. That decision arrived aboard a heavily fortified battle station orbiting a distant forest moon, where the young man, now grown considerably in both skill and wisdom since their last encounter, allowed himself to be captured deliberately, choosing to walk directly into danger, rather than continue avoiding the reckoning he now believed was inevitable. and necessary. He came not as a combatant seeking victory through violence, but as a son seeking, with quiet, unshakable resolve, to reach whatever remained of the father buried beneath the armor and the myth. His approach unsettled his father, in ways few things had managed to unsettle him across decades of service to the Empire, where the old Jedi Order had taught detachment, where his master demanded ruthless obedience. This young man offered instead something the father had not experienced, directed toward himself in longer than he cared to remember. Unconditional, patient, stubborn love, extended freely despite every reason the young man had to hate him instead. Brought before the Emperor himself, the true architect of every tragedy, woven through this entire story, the son refused again and again to strike down his own father, even when goaded and manipulated with exquisite cruelty, refused even when his father, still bound by decades of conditioned obedience and genuine fear of his master's wrath, engaged him in one final, devastating duel. The Emperor, delighting openly in the spectacle of father forced against son, pushed the confrontation toward its most brutal extreme, taunting the young man with threats against the sister he had only recently discovered, needling at exactly the same vulnerability, love for family, transformed into a weapon against oneself that had destroyed his father decades earlier. And for one terrible, understandable moment, the son's careful restraint broke entirely, rage overtaking him with a suddenness that frightened even himself, and he overpowered his own father in the ensuing exchange, standing over him with a blade raised and victory finally within reach. It was in that exact instant, staring down at his defeated father and hearing his master's gleeful encouragement to finish what he had started, to claim his birthright and complete his own turn toward darkness, that the son found within himself the strength his father had never quite managed to find at the equivalent moment of his own life so many years earlier. He looked at his own hand, mechanical now from injuries sustained in their confrontation, and saw in that damaged limb an unbearable mirror of the very fate he was being pushed toward, a fate that had already claimed his father entirely. And rather than strike the killing blow his master demanded, he cast his weapon aside entirely, declaring, with a conviction that startled everyone present, including himself, that he would not fall as his father had fallen, that he remained, whatever the cost, a follower of the light, rather than an instrument of vengeance and darkness. This refusal, this act of stubborn, uncompromising mercy, extended toward an empire's most feared enforcer and a defenseless young man's own tormentor, proved to be the single moment that finally, after decades of careful suppression, cracked open whatever remained buried beneath his father's armor. The Emperor, furious at being denied the completion of his carefully orchestrated plan, turned his full and terrible fury upon the unarmed young man instead, unleashing raw, destructive power directly at him, torturing him mercilessly while father watched. Forced to witness the suffering of the son he had only just begun to know. Suffering inflicted specifically because that son had chosen love and mercy over hatred and violence. Watching his own child writhe in agony before him, hearing the ragged, pained cries of someone who had shown him nothing but stubborn, unearned faith across every one of their brief encounters, something long buried within the father finally surfaced entirely, breaking through decades of conditioning, fear, and self-loathing, all at once. He remembered, in that instant, everything the armor and the mask and the endless obedience had been built specifically to help him forget. a mother's gentle love on a distant desert world, a wife's stubborn faith that goodness remained in him even at the very end, a teacher's grief-stricken hope that redemption might still somehow be possible. He remembered, too, the specific horror of watching helplessly as people he loved suffered for choices he alone had made. And he understood, with sudden and total clarity, that he was watching that exact horror repeat itself now. His own son suffering because of a war between father and master that the son had never asked to inherit. He moved then with a speed and a purpose that startled everyone present. A body that had spent decades in mechanical servitude finding, in this single desperate moment, enough of its old strength and will to act entirely on its own terms, for what may have been the first time in longer than he could remember. He seized his master, the architect of every tragedy that had unfolded across this entire story, the man who had manipulated a frightened, grieving young Jedi into becoming an instrument of unimaginable suffering, and with the last full measure of strength his broken body could summon, he lifted that master bodily and cast him down into the depths of the very station they stood aboard, ending in a single act of desperate and total sacrifice, the source of so much manufactured tragedy across so many decades. The act cost him everything that remained of his failing, mechanically sustained body, the very systems that had kept him alive since that volcanic world so many years earlier, damaged beyond repair in the violence of his final act of defiance, began to fail entirely, and he sank slowly to the floor of that chamber, dying at last as the man he had spent decades trying to bury, rather than as the monster the galaxy had feared for so long. His son knelt beside him in those final moments, removing, at his father's own quiet request, the mask that had concealed his face from the galaxy and from himself for the entirety of his years of servitude, allowing father and son, for the first and only time, to look upon one another without any barrier standing between them. What the son saw in that unmasked face was not a monster at all, but simply a man, scarred and broken and utterly exhausted, finally, impossibly at peace in the last moments of a life defined almost entirely by turmoil. He told his son, in those final fading moments, that he had been right about him after all, that there remained good in him, despite everything, echoing, without ever knowing it, the exact words his wife had once spoken with her own dying breath decades earlier, insisting on the same stubborn faith that had outlived every tragedy that came between the two moments. He asked, too, for one final mercy, to look upon his son with his own eyes, rather than through the mechanical lens of the mask and armor that had defined nearly his entire adult life, to see, if only for a few final heartbeats, the face of the child he had lost the chance to know for so many wasted years. And then, having finally found his way back to himself after decades lost entirely to darkness, he let go, passing from the galaxy not as the feared enforcer the wider public had known for so long, but as a father, reconciled at last with the son who had never stopped believing redemption was possible. His son carried his body down to the surface of the forest moon below, alone amid the celebration erupting across the galaxy, at the Empire's sudden and catastrophic collapse. On countless worlds that night, beings who had suffered for decades under occupation and fear filled streets and city squares with fireworks and dancing, embracing strangers in spontaneous, overwhelming relief, unaware that the very man whose name had haunted their nightmares for so long lay dying quietly in a forest, clearing on a distant, unremarkable moon, mourned not with celebration, but with the private, aching grief of a son who had just found and lost his father within the very same handful of hours. It was a strange and lonely counterpoint, that single small fire burning beneath ancient trees, while an entire galaxy erupted in joyous, unknowing celebration of the very death being mourned so quietly nearby. And he built for his father, with his own hands, a simple funeral pyre beneath a canopy of ancient trees. Far from any grand memorial the wider galaxy might have constructed for a figure of such infamy, had they known the truth of what had happened aboard that station. He stood alone beside those flames for a long while afterward, watching sparks drift upward through the forest canopy toward a sky, finally free of the empire that had ruled it for so long, feeling an exhaustion that ran deeper than any physical battle could account for. The particular weariness of someone who has spent every ounce of hope they possessed on a single, uncertain gamble and found, against every reasonable expectation, that the gamble had somehow paid off. He did not yet know how to carry what he had witnessed and accomplished that day, did not yet know how to reconcile the father he had glimpsed in those final unmasked moments with the monster the wider galaxy had feared for decades. And he understood, standing there in the quiet aftermath, that this reconciliation would likely take him the rest of his own life to fully complete, if it could ever be completed at all. There was no ceremony beyond the quiet crackle of flame, no crowd of mourners beyond a single grieving son, standing witness to the end of a story that had begun so many years earlier, with a small boy dreaming of freedom on a distant desert world. The armor and mask that had defined so many decades of terror burned alongside the body they had once contained, reduced finally to ash and memory, the last physical trace of the monster the galaxy had feared, dissolving quietly into the smoke of a forest fire on a moon most of the galaxy would never think to visit. And yet the story did not end entirely with that quiet pyre. In the years that followed, on occasions of particular significance, the sun would sometimes glimpse, at the edge of his vision, three translucent figures standing together in shared, peaceful communion. His father, as he might have looked before slavery and grief and manipulation, reshaped him, restored finally to the face he had worn before the fall, standing alongside his own former teacher and the wise old master who had guided his son. In turn, three spirits who had once stood divided by war and darkness and betrayal, reunited now in whatever peace exists beyond the boundaries of mortal life. It was, in its own quiet way, the truest resolution this tragedy could offer. Not a fall undone, for what happened could never truly be undone. Not a debt fully repaid, for the suffering caused across those dark decades could never be fully answered by any single act of redemption, however sincere. But a reconciliation nonetheless, proof that even the most total fall a soul can experience does not necessarily represent the final word on that soul's story. That somewhere beneath even the deepest darkness, something worth saving can sometimes still be found, waiting patiently for someone brave enough and loving enough to look for it. For most of the wider galaxy, the truth of that final reconciliation remained entirely unknown for a very long time. To the countless worlds that had suffered under the Empire's rule, the masked enforcer, who had spent decades enforcing its cruelty, was remembered, understandably and not unfairly, as an uncomplicated symbol of terror, a monster whose sudden absence at the empire's collapse was celebrated without any awareness of the quiet, private redemption that had made that collapse possible. His daughter, raised in different circumstances entirely from her brother, and unaware for most of her early life of their shared parentage, carried her own complicated relationship with the truth once it finally emerged. She had grown up in the shadow of loss herself, her adoptive homeworld destroyed as a demonstration of the very empire her father served, and reconciling that grief with the eventual revelation of her true lineage required a depth of grace that not everyone in her position could have managed. She chose, in time, much as her brother had chosen, to hold complexity rather than simple hatred, to understand that the man responsible for so much suffering had also, in the end, chosen love over power when it mattered most, without ever excusing or minimizing the very real damage his years of darkness had caused. History, as it so often does, simplified what had actually been an intricate and deeply human tragedy into cleaner, more digestible narratives. Some accounts emphasized only the villain, the masked enforcer whose name alone could silence a room full of seasoned soldiers, whose service to tyranny cost countless lives across decades of ruthless enforcement. Other accounts, particularly those passed down within circles that had known him before his fall, or among the small handful who understood the full truth of his final moments, emphasized instead the tragedy, the boy who had once dreamed only of freedom, twisted by grief and fear and manipulation into something he never would have chosen to become, had circumstances unfolded even slightly differently. Neither account, taken entirely alone, captures the full and complicated truth. He was both things simultaneously, villain and victim, monster and mourner. And the discomfort of holding both truths at once is, perhaps, exactly why this particular story continues to be told and retold across the galaxy, long after so many other tragedies of that same turbulent era have faded from memory. Consider for a moment how differently this entire story might have unfolded had any single thread been pulled just slightly earlier, just slightly more gently. Had the order he was raised within found a way to honor his grief rather than asking him to release it before he was ever taught how. Had his closest friend and mentor found the words, at any of 100 different moments across their years together, to voice the affection he clearly felt, but so rarely expressed aloud. Had he found even one person beyond the wife he was forced to hide, in whom he could have confided his growing fear without risking everything he had built? Had the smallest hint of the manipulation being worked upon him been recognized even slightly sooner by an order otherwise so attuned to sensing disturbances in the Force? Tragedy, examined closely enough, rarely announces itself as a single catastrophic choice. It reveals itself, instead, as an accumulation of smaller failures, smaller silences, smaller moments where connection might have been offered, but was not, where honesty might have been possible but felt too dangerous to risk. This is, perhaps, the story's most valuable lesson, more valuable even than its warnings about power and manipulation and the seductive lure of control in the face of fear. That the people around us who seem strongest, most capable, most in control, are so often carrying wounds every bit as deep as the ones we struggle with ourselves. Wounds that grow more dangerous, not because the person carrying them is fundamentally flawed, but because no one around them ever created enough safety for those wounds to be spoken aloud and tended before they festered into something catastrophic. There is comfort, too, buried within this tragedy. However dark, its central chapters remain. The story does not end with the fall. It ends, instead, with return, with a single act of love, powerful enough to undo, at least in part, decades of darkness that had seemed, to nearly everyone who witnessed it, permanent and irreversible. This matters enormously, not because it excuses the suffering caused along the way, but because it offers a kind of hope worth carrying forward, that no one, however far they have fallen, however thoroughly the world has come to see them as beyond redemption, is necessarily beyond the reach of love extended patiently and without condition. His son did not save him through force or argument or clever strategy. He saved him, in the end, simply by refusing to stop believing that saving him was possible, by extending trust and mercy even when every reasonable calculation suggested those gestures would be wasted or even dangerous. It was not naivety that drove this choice. It was, instead, a hard-won wisdom his father had never quite managed to learn himself, that love, offered freely, without demand for immediate proof of its worth, is sometimes the only force in the galaxy patient enough and strong enough to reach through even the deepest darkness. In the years that followed the Empire's collapse, the galaxy set slowly, unevenly, about the long work of rebuilding what decades of tyranny had broken. Worlds that had suffered under occupation began, gradually, to rediscover self-governance. The scattered remnants of the old Jedi Order, reduced across those dark decades to a handful of hidden survivors and their carefully guarded knowledge, found in the son who had refused to kill his own father the beginning of something new, an order rebuilt not on the same rigid detachment that had, in its own way, contributed to his father's fall, but on lessons hard-won through tragedy. That compassion and attachment need not be enemies of wisdom, that love, properly understood and properly supported rather than suppressed and hidden, could coexist with duty and discipline rather than threatening to undermine them entirely. Whether this new approach would prove wiser across the coming generations than the old order's philosophy remained. For those living through this uncertain rebuilding, an open question, but it represented, at minimum, a sincere attempt to learn from a tragedy few in the galaxy's history had paid a steeper price to understand. The desert world, where this entire story began, so many years and so many losses earlier, continued on, largely unaware of the outsized role it had played in galactic history, its twin suns rising and setting over the same harsh dunes, regardless of empires rising or falling far beyond its atmosphere. Somewhere beneath those same sands, the grave of a gentle, enslaved woman who had raised an extraordinary child with whatever tenderness bondage allowed her remained, unmarked and largely forgotten by the wider galaxy, though never forgotten by the son who buried her there, nor by the grandson who would, decades later, walk that same sand without ever fully understanding the invisible threads connecting him to a woman he had never known, but whose quiet strength had, in ways neither of them could trace, helped shape the courage that eventually redeemed his father in the final reckoning. History rarely honors its quietest, most foundational figures with the recognition they deserve. It was not the powerful senators or the celebrated Jedi masters or even the feared enforcers of empire who ultimately determined how this story ended, but a mother's patient love passed down like an inheritance across generations who never fully knew its source, resurfacing at exactly the moment it was needed most. His former teacher, too, carried the weight of this tragedy for the remainder of his own long life, retreating into exile on a remote and desolate world where he spent years in quiet, unresolved grief, wrestling with a guilt he never fully managed to set down. He replayed, endlessly and privately, every moment across their years together, where a different word, a different gesture, a different measure of patience might have altered the trajectory that led to such devastation. And he carried, alongside that guilt, the profound and complicated grief of loving someone so deeply, while also being the one who ultimately delivered the blow that ended his old life and began the mechanical nightmare that followed, when he finally chose, decades later, to guide the son as he had once guided the father. He did so with a wisdom tempered by failure, more willing this time to speak plainly of danger and fear rather than trusting silence and careful modeling alone to shape the outcome. It was not a perfect correction, and some of the same old patterns of restraint and caution persisted even in his renewed effort. But it represented, in its own quiet way, one man's attempt to learn from the deepest failure of his life, rather than simply burying it the way his former student had once buried so much of his own pain. And so this story closes, not with simple villainy triumphant, nor with simple heroism unblemished, but with something far more difficult and far more honest. A tragedy born of love, distorted by fear, redeemed, in its final moment, by love restored to its proper shape. It asks something of anyone who carries it forward into their own life, something worth turning over slowly in the quiet hours before sleep finally arrives. It asks whether the people around us, the ones who seem strongest, most composed, most in control, might be carrying burdens they have never found safety enough to set down. It asks whether patience and unconditional presence, offered without guarantee of reward, might be worth extending even to those who seem furthest from deserving it. And it asks, perhaps most gently of all, whether within each of us, however far we might imagine ourselves to have wandered from the people we once hoped to become, some ember of that original goodness still waits quietly to be found, patient and enduring, ready to be called back into the light the moment someone, anyone, cares enough to look for it. Perhaps that is why, of all the tragedies scattered across the long history of this galaxy, this particular story continues to be told and retold so many years after the fires of that empire finally went cold. Not because it is the bloodiest or the most dramatic, though it carries plenty of both, but because it is, underneath everything, achingly recognizable. Nearly everyone who hears it, if they sit with it honestly enough, can find some small fragment of themselves reflected somewhere within it. A fear they have never spoken aloud, a grief they buried rather than processed, a love they worried might one day cost them everything if they let themselves feel it fully. The tragedy of this particular fall was never really about lightsabers or armies or ancient prophecies, however much those elements shaped its outer form. It was about a heart that loved too much to bear the thought of losing what it loved, and a galaxy that never quite managed to teach that heart a gentler way to carry such love without being consumed by it. Let that thought settle now, soft and unhurried, as the story fades and rest finally arrives.